Right, okay, I'm recording and I'll start now. Hello everyone and welcome, and I'll just wait a few moments while people start joining. You can see people keep coming in. Okay, we've got quite a lot of people signed up, so I'll just wait a few more seconds and then I'll start the introduction. Okay, we'll get started. So welcome everyone to the fourth in this series of activism conversations. I know a lot of people who've signed up for this, but for people who don't know me, my name is Pippa Kukler and I'm the coordinator of the Human Rights Defender Hub at the Centre for Applied Human Rights at the University of York. As many of you will probably know, early in 2020, not long after the lockdown began, the Hub issued a call for activists, for collaborations of artists and activists who would respond to the impact of the pandemic on human rights where they were. The response was huge, and we were able to fund projects that used drag performance, murals, theatre, paintings, spoken word poetry, all kinds of art forms to draw attention to what was happening to human rights. These collaborations covered Indigenous rights, socioeconomic rights, responses to rising populism and authoritarianism, the rights of migrant workers and the rights of women, and the impact of the burden of care. So now, in a series of activism conversations, what we're hoping to do is to learn from these projects, to understand the new ways of working that evolved in these collaborations of artists and activists, and to look at the role that art can play in the fight for human rights. So we're recording these conversations and making them available on our website, and we'll also be publishing the conversations in the form of a working paper, and a bit later I'll put details in the chat of where you can find these conversations. So today's session is on reinventing care, and in a moment I'll be handing over to Maro Pantojaidou to introduce the conversation. But first I'd like to welcome and introduce our panelists. So first, Angarika Guha from Mara, which is a media and arts collective in India. And Angarika led activism projects on the burden of work on women, and these projects amplified the voices and experiences of workers. I was going to welcome Cassie, but I don't think she's managed to connect yet. So hopefully sometime soon, Cassie Thornton will be joining us. And Cassie is an artist whose project, The Hologram, imagines an alternative network of care, a future of care, a system where there's peer-to-peer caregiving. So welcome also to Tallulah Lines from Las Iluministas, a project that supports Mexican feminist activists and artists. And this project included an exhibition of artwork on the theme of the work of women and the increasing responsibility of care. And then finally, welcome to Maro Pantojaidou, who is chairing the panel today. And Maro is a PhD candidate with the Department of Politics here at the University of York. Her research looks at the politics and the distribution of working and non-working time and the surrounding future of work visions. Her practice is inspired by post-work theory, feminist critical theory and epistemologies, theories of the commons, and participatory and new materialist pedagogies. She's also previously worked as a researcher and a facilitator on social movement strategies, and she served as the head of impact and learning at Amnesty International. So welcome again to our panelists, and we hope our missing panelists will be with us soon, and I'll hand over to Maro to introduce the conversation.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay? Can I get yeah, great. And hi to everyone who's joining us right now. So yes, I'm Mara. Thank you, Pippa, for the introductions. I'm joining today from Athens in Greece, and I'm very glad we could create this moment to bring our contributors together. I think Tallulah is in New York today, or are you in London?
I'm in Newcastle, but yes, I'm in England.
In Newcastle.
Yeah.
And recently back from Mexico. Angarika is in Bangalore. And I really hope Kathy is having an issue. I really hope she can be with us any moment now. She's in Berlin. And everyone, just please do say hello in the chat and say where you're joining from today, if you wish. So yeah, I'm here to facilitate today's conversation on care. And we're very lucky, I feel, that we can reflect on care through and with the projects that today's contributors are creating at that intersection between art, activism, and, may I say, experimentation. So we hope to just have an informal conversation, a conversation full of care. And we want to start, I'll kick us off with a few questions, and we want to touch both on concrete experiences that come from this project, but also touch on our imagination and ideas of what care can look like in the future. And yeah, as I'll say, I'll start with a few questions, but as we go along, feel free to share questions or comments in the chat, and I'll see, we'll see our best to get those answered. So I think the first question, we'll start from the big picture, like from care as a concept. And I actually read in a paper just yesterday that care is having a moment and is becoming a buzzword. And I was like, oh no. So I want to steer away from any cynicism in this conversation and actually start from the gift that the re-emergence of the concept of care has brought to us. And what I mean is that really in the context of the pandemic, of the climate crisis, and of the general existing in crisis mode and in precarity that we have been experiencing over the past decades, we've seen care rising again as a concept, as a possible organizing principle for our personal lives and for societal transitions, as a point of inspiration, pointing maybe to more open-ended and less controlling ways to relate with each other and with nature as a whole, or maybe pointing to a turn away from a focus on perpetual growth and more a turn towards repairing our life world. So thinking big and thinking about meanings, I want to invite Tallulah and Angarika to say a few words about their project. What is it the project does and what they do? And how do you find, how does care find a home in it? What does it mean for you in the project? Tallulah, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Maro and Pippa for organising everything today, and thanks for inviting me. I really love talking about Las Iluministas, which is the project that I'm going to talk about today, and I'm particularly excited to be talking about care and how care came through in that project. Yeah, my name is Tallulah Lyons. I'm a PhD candidate in politics at the University of York, but I also work as a research associate at the university in the IGDC. And along with my friend and colleague, Alicia Salgado, we started Las Iluministas in 2020 as part of activism. So Alicia is based in Mexico City, and she's kind of more of the activist element, or she was at the time, more of the activist element of our pairing. And I joined as the kind of artist side, because I also kind of work as an artist as well as doing my research. And art plays a very central role in my research practice. So with Las Iluministas, our idea was just to provide a space for women, well, people who identified as women living in Mexico, to respond to the pandemic from a feminist perspective. So we kept our call pretty open, and we wanted to provide a space where women could create art from their perspective, so very much grounded in their own lived experience of the pandemic, and so that they could really decide what they wanted to prioritize through their art in terms of what was kind of the issues that were coming up for them during the pandemic. And we also wanted to create networks and provide an opportunity as well for those artists to be able to connect with each other and to get kind of their perspectives out through art. So that was our first open call in 2020, and what was really inspiring and impressive and interesting for us was how, without us giving any more kind of direction about the sort of art we wanted to receive or kind of the topics that we wanted it to touch on, kind of 5 themes emerged sort of organically from the art that the artists activists sent to us. And one of those themes, which I'll be talking mostly about today, was around politicized self-care and collective care. So there was also some artwork that came through around about the increased burden of care and disproportionate care that women would take on and did take on during the pandemic. And actually, that was a relatively small amount of artwork came through on that theme, which maybe I'll touch on later about some of the ideas I have around maybe why that could have been. But certainly politicized self and collective care was one of probably the strongest theme that came through. So again, hope I'll get more into that later. But yeah, so that was our project. That was the main kind of topic that I'll talk about today. We have ended up carrying on Las Iluministas, so we also released another open call last year, since we saw so much kind of passion and energy and a real desire for this kind of space to create and share feminist art. And we've also we're waiting to hear about funding to be able to do a third open call this year. So definitely, I think that speaks to not just our passion around using art in our activism, but also I think the passion from the people that wanted to collaborate and contribute with us as well. So yeah, so I'll stop for now, and yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Tallulah, and welcome, Cassie. We're very happy and relieved to have you, and it's super to see in the chat that there are people joining from Nicaragua to India, and thank you for being here in all those different time zones. So yeah, maybe moving to you, Angarika, if you want to say a few words about your project and how you feel that the concept of care sits in it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on this panel. Really happy to talk about some of the work that we've been doing, and big thank you to University of York for all their support. I think it was a really difficult time to be raising funds, and I think there was a lot of ease and a lot of understanding with how we managed to kind of secure support from them. So big thank you to Pippa and the team there. I basically work with arts and media collective in Bangalore, India, called Mara. Mara in Kannada, which is the local language here, it means tree. And we are a group of 5 to 6 people who have very varied interests. Some of us are filmmakers, some of us are theater artists, some are researchers, writers. But we've kind of broadly come together on certain, I think, political ideals that we believe in. And the collective has sort of been running now for 12 years. And we do like a range of different things, which I won't get into, but the project that sort of I want to talk about today is called Bevaru. And Bevaru in Kannada means sweat. And it was a newspaper. Bevaru started off as a newspaper in 2018, where we really felt that there was a lot of, there was no coverage really of workers in mainstream media. So anytime that you would hear about workers or worker-related news would be either if there was a protest or a strike, but there was absolutely no kind of no other kind of information really on workers. So we sort of began this project as a way of being able to mainstream issues of labor, but also of not reducing workers to, sorry, could you give me a minute? Because someone is frantically ringing the bell. I'm so sorry about this. Maybe Cassie could continue and I can kind of come back, if that's
Sure,
possible.
of course.
I don't know who that is. Yeah.
Of course. Cassie, hi, do you want to jump in?
Sure, totally. Having everybody working from home is so funny. What happens? I'm also staying in a place as a kind of like living experiment where there's lots of people living together, and so I wouldn't be surprised if there's drumming outside of the door soon. So we'll see. But my project is I actually for many years have worked as a kind of like an artist and an activist focusing on debt and how debt kind of affects our whole sense of self and how we're connected to our societies. And so I feel like I learned really intimately, like over the last maybe decade or decade and a half, like what it's like, especially I think as an American, to live in a way where like there's a lot of social isolation, a lot of a really big disconnect from feeling like sort of a part of your society or world, and how that connects to, yeah, living in a world that's filled with illegitimate debts and colonial debts, that as well as financial debts. And so after doing all the work that I had done about debt, I began to really want a kind of anecdote to that, or an antidote to that, like some sort of project that was not just about pointing to what debt does, but also kind of like undid some of the traces of debt that we might internalize and reproduce, like socially and imaginally and even in our bodies. And so the project that I've been working on comes from looking at debt, but it is kind of, I think, it offers a sort of a set of behaviors and practices that are quite in opposition to what debt teaches us. And so the project is called the Hologram, and it's basically a viral peer-to-peer health protocol. And so the idea of it actually came from studying Greek health clinics that had popped up, that were organized around the financial crisis in Greece in the early 2010s. That was at the same time as a big migrant crisis. So the amount of money that the medical system had really tanked, just as a lot of people needed a lot of care. And so I think, I was really inspired by some clinics that were offering totally free care from volunteer healthcare workers, but that some of them were asking for more and were actually trying to attempt to give non-hierarchical care. And so an experiment that was happening at the Social Solidarity Clinic in Thessaloniki, which is the second largest city in Greece, were around giving non-hierarchical care, or at least sort of pushing up against it. And one particular project was to have a patient seen by a doctor, a social worker, and a therapist at the same time. And when I was looking at that, I was really intrigued and kind of overwhelmed, because coming from an American context, that seemed like a proposition that in a squatted building, or in a squatted building run by volunteers, you would have such high quality care and attention given, that just felt so radical. And so for the last many years, since about 2016, I've worked with lots of different groups of artists and activists to kind of think through what it would mean to sort of try to do that project, which was called the integrative model, how to kind of reproduce this sort of high quality amount of like attention and care for people, like without experts, without money, without space. And so that project has become called the Hologram, and it really became a practice during the pandemic. Before the pandemic, there was a sense that it was a good idea, but that nobody really had time for it. And so what was really interesting about the pandemic is that people had time, and they really felt all of a sudden that they needed to actually have some practices and some new ideas for how to distribute care when we're in a moment where everybody actually could admit that they needed care, because all of the infrastructure of all of our lives in different ways and at different levels was obviously crumbling. And so the Hologram, it's a peer-to-peer viral model, and the idea is basically that three people focus on one person, and the three people that are doing the focused work are asking questions of this one person in a meeting, and then that meeting is meant to happen gradually over time. So it's a project about having like long-term relationships, and trying to see what happens when we can rely on a sort of formal peer-to-peer relationship over a long period of time, and then when reciprocation is a little bit different. So each of the people that are doing the care work in this project, a big part of the mechanism is that they also receive care from different people. And so it plays with lots of different parts of what it means to give and receive um, with care and also more generally. And so, yeah, I mean, and in the process of the pandemic, the project has become more of like almost an organization, like a messy organization, because many people are still practicing it and staying in touch with each other and trying to figure out ways to make the project more accessible to more people, because I think the people that use it realize that the only way that their health could actually really improve is if all the other people around them also had their health improve. And that's not something that we can all necessarily control outside of what we can do for each other at this point. So I think it's really interesting, because I think the thing that this project might be helping us understand about care for those of us that are practicing it is that like we actually we need a world where for everyone in order for us to be healthy, because all of our health is so connected. And I think this project isn't like a silver bullet, but it does show that there is one methodology, one practice that you could do that does actually make care move beyond like just a sort of small circle. The practice naturally grows between people. Is that a good start?
Definitely. So Cassie actually said to figure out also what it means to give and receive. And we already heard Tallulah saying how through making open calls for feminist art, politicizing self-care and collective care was one of the key themes that kept coming forward. So I just want to go back to Angarika and use this as a bridge to what would be the next question of moving from care as concept to care as work, as labor, and the long-held feminist debates about how do we approach this as work, the time, the skills, the whole materialities that go into making care happening. And Cassie was just speaking of a model and a methodology they're trying of creating horizontal care networks. But I want to, by going back to you, Angarika, and we've left you what you were saying, that your project Bevaru means sweat, and your work directly with workers, including female workforce in what maybe sometimes now we would be calling essential work. So if you want to talk to us a bit about how you have seen this issue of care work and recognizing care work changing throughout the pandemic and through your work.
Yeah, sorry about earlier. But basically, yeah, where I was at was, so we started off Bevaru as kind of a media platform where workers could express their own experiences, and it's taken various forms since. So it's gone through many iterations. It began in print, it was a newspaper, it became a YouTube channel, it became just a video channel, it's gone through, I mean, we've just been trying a lot of different models because we've been thinking about who the intended audience for this is. Is it primarily middle class, upper class publics who need to understand experiences of workers, or should we use this as a platform where workers across sectors can communicate and share and build solidarities? So it's gone through like various iterations. I think we're still in the process of searching. But what happened was that we had kind of foregrounded the attention on women workers who work in the informal economy. And in the context of India, broadly, that was garment workers, sex workers, women who clean garbage from the streets, and domestic workers. And all of this is a huge gaping gap in mainstream media. I mean, you'd hardly hear about any of their experiences. But what I wanted to comment about specifically with regard to care, because when I got your questions, I was really thinking about how it applies to the context in which we were working. And there were two things that kind of came to mind. One was that all the workers that we work with, these are all caste-based occupations. So these are hereditary occupations, and caste is a social relationship that governs primarily the entire fabric of life in India. So this is work that is kind of handed down generation to generation, and there's very little choice that kind of operates in this context in terms of the kind of work that you do. And that got me thinking about what care could mean without the concept of choice, or particularly in a context of coercion. And a lot of this work is often framed as care for the entire society. So it would be, for example, even the term essential work. So it would be that garbage needs to be cleaned because everything needs to be sanitized and healthy, and domestic work is necessary, and all of this stuff. But the workers themselves were denied, I mean, any kind of basic rights. And I think specifically, I mean, of course, all of us would be familiar with the structural issues, whether it's housing or wage or access to healthcare. But I think specifically there was a complete lack of dignity. And that also made me think about what care means in a context where social relations are completely unequal. And there is an expectation that someone will perform a particular role, but there's no reciprocity in terms of whether it's structurally, materially, discursively, I mean, on all fronts. So, I mean, that was kind of one thing that I wanted to talk about because, and of course, all of these workers are women. So there's kind of a double, triple labor that goes unaccounted for, because there is the work that you would do in the public space, so-called. But for example, in the context of domestic workers, they're not really recognized as workers in the Indian legal system. So you're often working in private spaces where you're performing acts of care for the family, but you have no security with regard to your rights or any kind of redressal mechanism, or really any kind of accountability at all. And then there are other workers, like, for example, the garbage collectors, who are working directly under the government. But where, by virtue of the kind of work that they do, there is a lot of stigma and discrimination around precisely all of the issues that became so heightened during the pandemic, of cleanliness, of hygiene, of how to stay isolated, how to stay safe, how to stay sanitized. And these become very complex when you situate them in the context of caste. Because the caste system is built on ideas of who is untouchable and who is touchable. So, and then likewise in the case of garment workers and sex workers. So, I mean, I could go on with examples, but I think what I really wanted to kind of foreground was how do we locate ideas of care within an unequal set of relations. And what we really found was, what we found very inspiring was the practices of care that were happening within these communities. And I think that's something that I kind of want to pay attention to, because in most cases, pandemic or no pandemic, there's really nobody for them to reach out to. Often families also are a space of complete violence and discrimination. So it's really kind of the very intricate networks of kinship and friendship and kind of caregiving that form within workers, whether it's whether it's at work or otherwise, that I think is something that we wanted to also foreground, because I think there is a lot of resilience and dignity in that. And that's something that completely, of course, got whitewashed by the media, because I'm sure you're all familiar with images that were coming out of India at the time of workers, like throngs and throngs of workers walking back from cities, and just all of this, lot of helpless, abject, like this economy of suffering that was kind of being circulated, which really, I think, completely whitewashed a lot of these other ways in which people were holding each other, and I think keeping their dignity intact. So, I mean, I can probably get into more detail in the second part of the question that you have, but broadly speaking, I just wanted to share this.
Angarika, thank you so much for, it's like opening a door, right, in a very complex and rich world. And I think, Cassie, you were speaking a bit about a model or a methodology you're experimenting with to find these relationships of reciprocity and to build this politics of interdependence. And then, Angarika, you're situating into this wider system of how does this work, this entrenched inequality. And you did also mention, you went back to, also going back to kinship and the home and that not being a safe space. So I just want to kind of throw a bit this ball back to Tallulah, because I think a lot of the art that was created had to do with the experience of lockdown, of staying at home, of what care might or might not mean in this setup. And I think you did mention in the beginning how the issue of care work came up or did not come up in the artwork you were receiving through your call. So maybe do you want to say a bit more about this, about the dimension of the home and what you have seen through your project?
Yeah, sure. So as I said, the artwork that we received we felt to sort of organically fit into these different themes. So we had themes around gender-based violence, about the burden of care, the disproportionate and gendered burden of care in the home, politicized self and collective care, kind of introspective work, and then ideas for a more feminist or a more positive future coming out of the pandemic. So actually, out of all of those 5 kind of different themes, the theme that we received less work around was about this disproportionate burden of care. And we didn't go back to the artists to ask why that was or anything, but I certainly, after conversations with Alicia, who's my partner on Las Iluministas, we certainly kind of came up with we reflected on it and kind of wondered why that might be. And we thought perhaps one of the reasons why we received less work around that could be to do with the way care is, the value of care, and how important that is seen in general in society. So certainly I think some of the main kind of policy discussion areas that appeared certainly regionally in Latin America during the pandemic were around gender-based violence, informal work, and care came up as well. But I mean, I don't know how much that kind of trickled down into everyday on the ground lived experiences. So we certainly saw a lot of that at the kind of top down level, particularly kind of regional and global level, thinking about the UN and so on, UN Women and ECLAC and all these kind of regional bodies who really talked about care and the importance of care at that level. But then on the ground, I mean, I wonder how far that kind of trickles down into kind of having a sort of impact and is being sort of taken seriously by people in their home lives, in their relationships, and so on. And perhaps, for example, obviously gender-based violence became a very a hugely pressing matter. It's always a pressing matter, but in the context of the crisis, for all the reasons that we know, everybody being pushed back into the home, stress, etc., in a misogynistic world. Obviously gender-based violence became a huge issue that was talked about, and very rightly so. And I wonder sometimes if care is just not seen as, I certainly don't think that the burden of care is seen as the violence that it really is as well. So we have this continuum, this spectrum of gendered violence, and care and depletion is from care is on there as well, but I don't think that is kind of so recognized as more physical or sexual or psychological violence. So I wondered if the artists who responded to our call were responding to the way care is or is not conceived in society. But another thing on a very practical level, we asked, this was at the very beginning of lockdowns, that we launched our open call and we asked people to respond. That was when there was school closures, that was when there was the kind of perhaps the greatest impact, the greatest stress of industries closing down and so on. And it could just be on a very practical level, women didn't have time to do a picture and send that in to us. So it could have been that as well. And so if the artists who did respond to the call, perhaps they in their lives had other sorts of priorities and weren't themselves dealing with this disproportionate burden of care, and as such responded through with the themes that were priorities for them. And the women who did see care more as a priority perhaps were too tied up in doing extra care work to be able to participate. So that was just some reflections that Alicia and I had about why perhaps we received less on that topic than on other themes.
Okay, I think we're getting to something, or maybe I'm drawing the threads, that is really at the heart of a lot of the care dilemmas or conundrums. And we can see care work as a burden, right? And the violence that can be entailed, or the lack of reward, or care as the beautiful thing that makes us flourish and thrive. in creating different networks of living together, such as what the hologram is, or she care as resilience, as what Angarika was, right? So as for the people joining us, as you hear about these experiences, if there are any questions or if there are any thoughts about what care means to you or what you think should be discussed more, please put them in the chat. And while you do that or think of it, my question to the three of you is going back, I mean, maybe thinking of the reinvention in the title, thinking of these experiences you've started sharing, what do you want to share with the group today about what would it mean to reorganize care, right? Like, what are you learning? I know it's a big question, right? But thinking of it as a burden or as a gift or as resilience, what do you think we should creatively reorganize in the debate we're having around it or in the way we practice it? And it can really be like just a snippet from your experience. We're not asking for grand theory here.
I could like offer some sort of a beginning. I think something that like I've personally been thinking about because of now, of course, there is a lot of so I'm going to contradict what I said earlier, but because now, of course, there is a lot of attention on care as work, and duly it needs to be duly recognized as labor and all of that which comes with it, which I think probably all three of our work touches on. But it also kind of got me thinking about whether care is becoming commodified, and that the more you link it to something that is quantifiable as work, or is something that kind of is situated within some sort of a transaction that requires a certain kind of acknowledgement, be it with regard to wage or structure or access or whatever it is. I wonder what that does to the concept of care, and whether we then begin to situate certain practices as care while actually ignoring or overlooking, not ignoring, other practices that possibly exist outside that vocabulary. So, for example, with the examples that I was kind of giving earlier, there was I think what something that we found really odd was that there was so much emphasis during the pandemic, for example, on self-help and self-care and mental health, and prioritizing all of these very necessary things. But by virtue of the vocabulary in which in which these conversations happen, it excludes a large percentage of people, not only because of language and English and all of those things, but also because it is premised on a particular understanding, I think, of normalcy or of sanity or of madness. And in many cases, I feel very much very much centered on the idea of an individual. And I think in the cultures that at least we live in over here, it's very difficult to demarcate self and collective. And you are produced as much by the conditions you live and work and are born in as you are perhaps by your individual agency, will, and choice. And I feel like these were kind of some things I got really left out of conversations on what care could mean. And it became, I think it became, in some cases, it felt like some of the discourse was kind of moving toward a certain commodification, which made me just sort of wonder about a few of these things. So, yeah.
Cass, I see you nodding as Angarika speaks. Do you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, I'm so curious about what you just said, because I feel so locked in a very like American, North American way, which is, I realize, like hyper individualist. And so much of what I've been working with and on is how to just for a second distribute the labor of care so that it isn't all reliant on individuals. Like, because as much as like self-care is, it's it's it comes from this, I mean, it comes from so many different things, but one way that it arrives is that like in one result of capitalism is this sort of sense of individual responsibility, and that really the only all you really have is yourself and your ability to work. There's a sort of self-reliance and a self-importance that comes with that. And so the simple thing that I hoped for in the hologram was just seeing if we could produce energy by distributing the labor of care. So when 3 people give their attention to one person, does that mean that we can sort of derail ourselves from the idea and the actuality of exhaustion? And could we actually make like caring into something that yeah, that we can begin to see as not necessarily reliant on one amazing heroic person that we can lean on, especially when we're thinking of like informal non-professional care. Can we lean into groups of people rather than on individuals, so that maybe we can take some of the pressure off of being a carer and maybe make it like lighter and maybe produce energy? Because I think that like the thing that happens a lot in conversations around care and care work and valuing care is like it's really important, but it's like I think it's important as a part of a longer journey or path towards a world where giving and receiving care is something that we want to do and that we can do, but that doesn't have to be valued by a wage, because maybe we can eventually live in a world where not everything good gets commodified and financialized. And so I think that like the thing that I would add to what's already been said is just that like yeah, that in the conversations around care that there was like a horizon that's even further away from us, but that a goal that we have where more people participate in caring work and supportive work, that it's like enjoyable and life-giving and that we respect it, but that we don't necessarily need to monetize it in order to show our respect and love for this thing that seems to naturally come out of most every person. Yeah, there's so many other things to say about it, but maybe that's a good moment to stop.
Sure. I raised my own hand by mistake. And I think, Cassie, you're really touching on this very strong debate about, is it about decommodifying or is monetizing or rewarding? And I think Sophia's question in the chat, which I encourage everyone to read because it's really beautifully articulated, so I won't read it out all, but it gets to this point of also what is the role of the state and a welfare state, which I know might be a lost dream in some countries or something that was never even a reality or accomplished in other countries. So if any of you wants to come in on this point of what do we think the role of the state should be in the now and in this longer horizon, maybe.
I mean, I can say something to maybe start us off, which is just that I think I'm just thinking about like COVID response. And I'm just thinking that like, you know, there's a way that the state, the many states that we live under and with, as well as the way that they interact with lots of different private companies, caused a situation where we pumped a ton of money into the idea of health without actually really producing that much health. And so I guess like looking at what happened in the way that we distributed money and attention and time during COVID, I think if if I could wish for the state's role right now, it would have been to maybe like have a little bit of a broader sense of how to distribute some of that attention and money and support to actually create health on many levels that's much more sustainable and long term. Because if with the amount of money that went towards COVID response, like imagine how much clean water or housing or other types of healthcare could have been kind of like built up, especially if that would have been done like, you know, not all in 2 years, but in a sort of with a long-term sense of preservation and planning. And so yeah, I guess maybe one possible answer is to actually like have a little bit of a broader view, so that when there's a lot of money and resources going in, that we're not just looking at one tiny problem, but actually able to sort of see how health is the thing that is entangled into all parts of our society. And so resources need to be used in that way.
Absolutely. So yeah, let's do this next few minutes with the advocacy moment. So Kasir just share a wish for the state about a more integrative understanding, I think, as we said, of health. Tallulah, what would your wish be? And then Angarika, we can come to you.
Well, I think that so I mean there was quite a difference in terms of the way that care was conceptualized in the artwork that we received. So as I was saying before, within the home, the artworks that we received kind of focused a lot on, as I said, seeing care kind of like as a burden, and disproportionately falls towards women. And so a lot of the pieces were kind of more negative that we received around care as understood in that way. And I think that my idea for the role of what the state can do in that sense is around the basic things. I mean, I say basic, they seem to be quite complicated to put into place, otherwise they perhaps would have been already, but decent childcare, free, accessible, safe, decent childcare, flexible maternity, paternity policies, flexible working, and all that kind of structural stuff that would enable caregivers of all genders to be able to kind of take on that this kind of social reproductive role of care more equally. But then on the other hand, the other sorts of kind of artwork that we received that dealt with the theme of care was, as I said at the beginning, which was more around politicized self and collective care, which I was really kind of felt that Angarika's point about how there's not really, there can't be a separation between self and collective in our society. So that resonated with a lot of what we saw, where artists would respond with artwork that dealt with self-care, politicized self-care, from the perspective usually of feminist activists, but that always seemed to like flow into collective care. So the idea of caring for oneself as an activist politicized subject was so that activists could be stronger to maintain the strength of their collective. And not necessarily from Las Iluministas, but from other activism that I've been involved with, feminist activism I've been involved with in Mexico. There are certainly very strong collective care networks. So what the state doesn't provide, feminist activists and women provide for each other. So things around support in terms of different violences that women face, emotional support, legal support, psychological support, all of that stuff comes from activists to activists. And so in that sense, what the state could provide is again something which sounds basic, but which doesn't happen, which is to guarantee legal rights, a life free from violence, those sorts of what we see as fundamental human rights. But for example, in terms of, particularly in the Mexico context, if we think about the high rates of feminicide and huge rates of impunity, if the state was less implicated in creating and perpetuating those conditions of violence and feminicide, etc., that care that women, feminist activists show to each other wouldn't need to be so intense because there wouldn't be such a strong need for it. So guaranteeing safety and not being so implicated in the creating and the perpetuating of violence is another thing that the state could and should do.
Thank you for that perspective, Tallulah. And Angarika, what is your take on the advocacy movement and thinking of the perspective of the workers you've shared the Bever project with?
I think it's really difficult to talk, kind of taking off from what Tallulah said, it's really difficult to figure out, for me personally, how to hold the state, imagine anything from the state right now, because we are in a right-wing government in India. And by virtue of that, it's predominantly a fascist and authoritarian kind of climate that one is living in. So it's very difficult to think about any kind of possibility from the state until the government changes, to be quite honest. But I think two things that I would like to root it back to would be quite a question of recognition and a question of dignity. And I think because because we're talking about labor and because our project is kind of located at this intersection of the labor of care, but also care within labor, and also the way in which labor is constructed within the kind of context that we work in. I think primarily one of the things that we saw during the COVID response, for example, was the imagination of what relief is. And I just want to use that as an example. So, for example, first of all, most workers, particularly workers in informal economies or migrant workers, are not recognized as workers. So, by virtue of that, you any which way don't have access to any kind of redressal mechanism, and you're just at the kind of mercy of contractors and private companies who pretty much packed their bags and left during the pandemic. But what I think really struck us was that when we were going out to do COVID response, and we were quite active in that, first of all, the state was absent in most cases. But even when one through some kind of sort of advocacy managed to get them, the imagination of relief is like a box of rotting potatoes or half a liter of oil for a family for a month. And I think this really kind of foregrounds what the imagination is of how you feel people should live and work. And even though these are workers who are pretty much essential to the city or building the city, your imagination of what they need is kind of reduced to that one relief box. And it was just a huge facade, because what you had to stand in long queues to get it, you had to produce identification, which most workers don't have. And then at the end of it, you have to pose for a photograph and appear very grateful as to the fact that the government has done this bare minimum. So I think it's kind of intertwined, this concept of recognition and of dignity of labor. And I think doubly so in the context of women from lower caste communities. So I think if the state was to pay more, if the state was, I really, at this point, I don't think it's going to happen. But if the state was to be able to redress any of these labor conditions, it would go back to dignity of labor and actual recognition of workers.
Thank you. And actually, big thanks for those answers to all three of you, because again, in different ways, I think we're touching on all these different levels of state intervention, or even the existence of the state, from like do no harm, what Alula is saying, they're implicated in the lack of safety, as in the case of Mexico, to more like when immediate measures of relief. And I think we've all witnessed such illogical, if not to say actually undignified types of response or emergency relief, to the broader horizon of what Cassie was saying. If you're going to spend 3 years throwing all these immense resources into health, what does health mean more holistically, and how are we all connected in it? And I know well, I'll say this again. So I want to ask you a last question, which came actually also through the chat. I'm just using it and changing it a bit because it was something I wanted us to discuss anyway. And that's turning a bit the light back to you and your communities. And I know all three of you work at this intersection of art and politics, and you work in collectives. And in some case, like Angarika, you have been building Mara, the tree, for 12 years, which I think you should do like a session just on that. It's really hard to keep the longevity and sustainability of activist collectives. And the pandemic has been a challenge internally for many horizontal and other networks. So is there something you can share with the company today about how you have managed to hold each other during this period? If you found any new ways or practices that made your experience in your networks and collectives more caring?
Well, I can start if that's all right with the others. As I said, so Las Iluministas actually we only started along with the pandemic, but we have continued throughout. And as I said, we've put in an application for funding to continue with another call this year. So I think really, so in the first year, sorry, it was just Alicia and I worked together. And then for our open call last year, which was around gender-based violence and feminicide, we teamed up with a UK-based colleague as well to do a kind of collaboration between Mexican artists and UK artists. And really, I think that it's actually strengthened our relationships between Alicia and I, and between Michaela, who was our collaborator last year. Our relationships really have strengthened, like personally and professionally, I think, as a result of working together on these projects. And I think that a lot of that is because we're very passionate about what we're doing. We're very passionate about the politicized role of art within activism, but we're also very passionate, I think, about living feminist lives, to quote Sarah Ahmed, who's just my absolute favorite author at the moment, favorite thinker. So I think we're very passionate about kind of putting our values into practice as well. So when we've approached, they've been incredibly busy projects that we've ran, and it's not the only thing that we're doing. So we're all doing, trying to juggle lots of different things at once, different responsibilities, personal, professional, academic, and so on. And I think we've just been very, we've approached each other with a lot of compassion and a lot of understanding and kind of a lot of humanity, really. And of course, we want to have the best results possible that we can for our projects because we care so much about them, but we also want to have the warmest and most caring working relationships as well. And I've also seen that in another project that I was part of last year, which was a mural painting project with activists in Mexico. And we were painting murals of victims of feminicide in Mexico, along with the victims' families and with other activists. So very kind of emotionally and physically intensive work. And throughout that, again, our bonds as a collective really strengthened by, again, kind of putting these feminist values into place through the way we were working. So yeah, we would come together and we'd paint, and it would be these very strong, very emotional experiences. And we'd ensure that that wasn't the only time we saw each other. We'd do stuff together, we'd go for food, for drinks, we'd go to the beach, we'd make sure that we weren't just laboring intensively together, but we were also kind of nurturing our relationships together. And I think that that is absolutely what we need in the way that we do work, the way we do activism. And so I've certainly had positive experiences in terms of how we've built those relationships together, just by being kind of compassionate and human with each other, I think, really.
I think I can kind of take off from there, because when you asked the question, I think my mind was going toward really simple daily practices that we kind of have in Mara. Like, for example, we cook together and we eat together, and we ensure that once a week we sit and write together. And writing for us has kind of really helped in a way to sort of figure out where everyone's state of mind is at. And we try and move that outside of project frameworks to really, I think as a collective, we're very invested in each other's sense of self and in each other's journey in ways that go beyond activities and projects and deadlines and timeframes. And in fact, it's been very dispiriting and quite lonely actually in the last couple of years, because a lot of the collectives that we sort of started out with, a lot of them shut down. And I mean, there were various reasons. Of course, there was funding and all of that. But I think a lot of it was also a certain kind of violence embedded within the working structure, be it of hierarchies, or be it of not really taking the time to listen to each other, or this insane pressure to produce, whatever it might be. And I think that we've tried really hard to keep the collective as horizontal as possible. So there are ways in which there are all of the things that Tallulah mentioned. But of course, there are also equally, I mean, we're all very critical of each other. And there is definitely a certain demand in terms of being rigorous with the ideas that one is signed up for. But I think what's really helped us is to, within the formation of the collective, imagine it outside of kind of structures of projects and timelines and things like that, and really pay more attention to process and take the time to tussle with those questions. And the other thing that I think has really kept us going, which is that we interact with a lot of different kinds of people. And that really helps, because sometimes there's a tendency to get locked into what you feel, for example, is a crisis, or what you feel is a way of responding. And I think because Mara's work takes us to very diverse socioeconomic cultural locations, we have been immensely, immensely lucky, I think, to learn from very different ways of coping, very different ways of situating the problem, and also learn from a lot of people who kind of have a very different way of looking at the rhythm of life itself. And I think we've benefited a lot from that. So I think definitely kind of keeping that diversity alive in your circles of work and who you're talking to, and where you're choosing to position the problem and which perspective you're looking at it from. That's, I think, definitely also helped.
Thank you. And Cassie, do you want to conclude with your lessons or advice about keeping the care going within your network?
Yeah, I think I just feel like it's so clear now that like what's happening sort of out of a group is what's happening also outside, or what happens internally like really does create the possibility or the chance for what is growing outside to be as like sort of healthy as it can be. And I just feel like what we learned in lots of different groups I'm in is just about moving slowly and actually centering the relationships rather than centering the deadlines. And so that means that our meetings are framed by like checking in and finding out how everybody is. And because the hologram is now like it's just, maybe a group of around 20 people organize it. There's lots more stops and starts than any project that I've ever worked on, but the project does also feel like it has the energy to keep going. And I think it has to do with making sure that all the people that are working also have support. And so it's small, and it's a small, concentrated, idealistic place for us where we can kind of like attempt to actually like practice our politics a little bit. And know that all the people that are giving care are also receiving care. And finding out and asking questions about those things has been really important. But I think really like the restructuring of time around relationships and around making sure that like that everybody's kind of like ability to participate is centered. And so sometimes that means that things just have to move at a really, really different pace. And I think it's complicated, and I feel like it's a real challenge, like with ourselves and with the outside world. But it seems like it's worth the experiment to just sort of see what it takes, see what it means, and what it feels like to wait for people, and to like be open to sort of seeing what comes out of people working when they're well, or people working when they're supported. Yeah.
Thank you. And I really want to, I hope I can get you together once again some point in the future to discuss about rethinking and restructuring time, which is a topic very close to my heart and in the heart of my research as well. And saying that, thank you also to everybody who stayed with us for a few minutes past the hour. And we're gonna wrap this up now by thanking you very, very deeply from my heart, from sharing from your heart. I hope this was warm, as Tallulah said, and we need to keep it warm. And I also want to say to everybody listening to us that if this sounds like a bit all over the place, it's about like feminist art and about relationships and about the state and violence and commodification. It is because care is about all these things, and it is what makes it magical, and I think so worth thinking about how to reinvent it. And also thank you to the University of York for supporting Tallulah's and Angarika's projects, and for Cassie for joining as a guest, coming through another project, and for Pipa for organizing everything. And I'm making this up, looking at Pipa. We're gonna send you links to the projects of Tallulah, Angarika, Cassie, and co, and a couple of other things that were mentioned and might be interesting for people to read or have a look at. So yeah, we're going to follow up with an email, and the conversation is also going to be posted online, along with the 3 conversations that preceded it. So you can share it with friends, and you can rewatch if you want to hear something. And I think that's all for today. And thank you all very, very much. And take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank you, Meryl.
Thank you, Maru. Right.